Welcome back. Today I have an extra special guest who I've been hoping to interview for a long time, and so I'm excited that we finally found the time. And that is my dear friend Kamie, who I am proud to say just got her PhD in curriculum and instruction. And in a little bit, she's going to tell us what exactly that means. You all know that I have a background in education, and so I'm so proud that a good friend of mine has advanced as far as she has in education. And so today we're going to cover a lot of different topics. How wonderful her work is for the world of education. I'm so proud that I have someone who I believe in, this much. But also how she did it, because as we've talked about quite a bit on this show, it's difficult to stick to your dreams and stick to your goals. And so I'm hoping that you will benefit from everything that she's learned about how to achieve something as magnificent as your PhD. So stay tuned. It's going to be wonderful. And just like I have with my past guests, I'm going to start out by welcoming her. So welcome, Kamie.
Thank you, Jenna.
And I would love to ask you a couple get to know you questions first for my listeners. And one famous one that I do is just asking you about something you love. So what is something that you love?
Yeah, my brain went a couple of different places, and it's exciting to be here. This is my first podcast, and I don't even really listen to podcasts very much, so this is a little bit new for me. Before I answer your question, I hope
they'll
so.
listen to you.
So my pat answer is I love hot tamales because I just love cinnamon. But I think what I really love is that I'm a dancer, and I think anybody who has done something their whole life, sometimes loving something like that, you have periods of boom and bust, where sometimes it feels like such a big part of you, and then sometimes it feels like such a deep passion that it almost hurts. And so I would say that I love dancing, and I love being a dancer, and what that means now as I'm a little bit older is something that is almost something I claim for myself. I don't know if that's a silly answer.
That's a really beautiful way to say it. Something that you claim for yourself. Really beautiful way. I think that's a really powerful message in general, because dance has been extremely common throughout human history, right? But I think some of the things that are the best for us have a way of becoming something that is just for us, even though it has these universal maybe health and connection benefits. That's what's really beautiful about some of those things. So thank you for sharing.
Sure.
What about something that bugs you?
Yes. It really bugs me when people can't apologize for something that they did. I feel like it's human nature for us to make mistakes. It's really not that big of a deal, but it really bugs me when people can't just take a second to say oh, my bad. I'm sorry, I just made a little mistake there. And I find myself being much more forgiving of people for big things when they're able to just own it. Whereas even if it's something small, if I notice that someone's not apologizing or just owning it in any way, it really bugs me.
Mm-hmm. I 100% agree. And I've listened to experts in their fields on different podcasts who've talked about how that's a major thing that needs to shift in society, and how you actually, even though there's this stigma of needing to be right, and it's as if you should be ashamed if you're wrong, which you absolutely should not, but I think people think that, but it's similarly to you, I have so much more respect for somebody who can say, oh, I'm sorry, my bad, or oh, I didn't know that, okay, and these, successful people who I like to listen to talk about how much more powerful our culture would be if we could just shift to people being more comfortable with owning, a mistake and learning from it, rather than pushing this, no, I'm right, or I can't let go of my pride. So,
and it's actually something that was really interesting for me as I transitioned, because I moved from New York City to Minnesota, which is not an easy shift.
No.
And I don't think that everything's perfect in New York City, but it will, I think, surprise people who know both cultures to see how often in New York people are much faster to say my bad or sorry. And I think part of that comes from that conversation isn't going to continue. It's going to be a quick interaction because there's so many people. But to be there where people are told they're not very nice, which we're not in New York, but that there's a kindness, and we kind of call it this nice but not kind, or kind but not nice. And so in the city, I feel like people are very kind. They'll carry your bags. They'll get out of your way or be more aware of, like, the human condition and are much faster to say like, oh, my bad, or sorry, or even just like give a little wave. And then coming to Minnesota, which is so well known for being nice, and to have like actually very limited kindness shown in interactions was really hard for me to be like, what is going on?
Yeah, let's talk about that for a minute, actually, because I have two things to say. Number one, that's another thing that I love about Kamie is that she has moved before. She's lived in different states, and I admire her a lot for being able to just go somewhere and try something, which you have, and I think that's phenomenal, even with moving here. But I think really what it is with the Minnesota nice thing is it's more Minnesota polite than it is actual nice, because I think it's like people will wave to you when they're walking by, even if they're strangers. I think that's maybe what the nice is. Like there's the common wave to your neighbor, or even wave to a stranger if you're walking by them on the street. But I don't know that it I beneath the surface, because I think people in Minnesota are very non-confrontational.
Yeah.
And I hesitate to even use the word confrontation, because sometimes it's just having some honesty to figure something out, and people avoid that like the plague in the state. And so it kind of becomes more, I think the saying Minnesota passive aggressive would be more appropriate. So
yeah. And I really do like that they're nice but not kind. That there's niceties, but it doesn't feel genuine deep down. And I do think part of it is because of this big fear of being wrong, and possibly because that fear of being wrong means that if there was a confrontation, that you just lost it, or that you're at fault for creating confrontation. And so, yeah, I just think that the way that people own their own selves tells you a lot about a culture and a lot about what someone is able to own about themselves, which is repetitive.
No, that was a really beautiful way to say that. I can't even, I want to like reiterate it to make sure the listeners heard, but the way that people own themselves, is that right? Yeah. That's beautiful. You can tell a lot about a person and a culture based on those things. So I'm glad that you said that. And speaking of being genuine, I would love to learn about some of your motivation for your PhD. But to back up, I know PhD or getting your doctorate is something that a lot of people have heard of, but maybe people don't fully understand what the title of PhD means. So could you help us out with just explaining that?
Absolutely. Okay. Yes. I didn't really know. I remember being an undergraduate and hearing even of grad school, and that wasn't something that I really knew that much about either. So I'm with the listeners. So we have like levels of education, and when you go to college after high school, you're normally getting a bachelor's, and there's a bachelor's of art and a bachelor's of science. And sometimes people have feelings about which one is better, but that's normally your bachelor's degree. And then
they're usually 4 years.
4 years, typically. Yep. I took 4.5. So shout out to anybody out there who's on the slow train. But then you have in graduate school, you can have master's or doctorate degrees. And a master's level education is normally about 2 years. And I don't mean this as the flex that it is going to sound, but I have two. I have a master's of arts and a master's of education, which is slightly more rigorous and is sometimes called like a advanced master's degree. And then there's the doctorate, and you can have medical doctors, even actually lawyers they have a doctorate in, I think it's justice or the judicial system, but that's why they're called JDs. And so a PhD, there's also education doctorates, is just a level of education after master's. Okay. And when you finish, you are technically called a doctor. And at least for me, for all of those degrees for master's and doctorate involved some sort of big project. So my master's degree, it was a thesis. I think there are some fields where your PhD is also a thesis, but for us it was a dissertation, and you have some sort of big project at the end that sort of passes you along.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like the reason you have a project, because I have my master's and I remember doing my thesis, I feel like part of the reason for the thesis and the dissertation is sort of to make sure that you're qualified for academia. Isn't that part of it? Because so much of academia is research-based, and well, research-based, right? Would you say that's part of it?
I think that it is. I think it's a way to do an assessment to decide if you can do some of the things that they're asking for in the degree on your own. So not all degrees are focused on research. There are, like for us in education, there are teaching institutions that focus more on the practice, but the University of Minnesota is a Research 1 institution. And it's a little bit like, I don't know enough about sports, but I think it's similar to how they have like different divisions of sports stuff.
You're probably right. It sounds right.
So I think that's about right. And so like I went to Teachers College, which was part of Columbia, and that's not a Research 1 institution. But I think that for a doctorate, you are supposed to prove that you can make a contribution to the field, that you have found some sort of gap is often what they say, or a hole, and that you are able to do all of the things that involve a research project, where you're able to design a study on your own, go through the ethical sort of process of getting approved, conducting the research, collecting data, analyzing it, and then writing it up. And I think in a master's degree, the focus is about, can you create an argument and support it in some way? And that's at least the way that I thought of my thesis projects. So I don't know if that answered your question.
It does. And I think contribution to the field is a really beautiful way to explain it, right? Because things like education, psychology, art, they've been around forever, but I can see how maybe distinguishing someone as a doctor or even holding the title of master's degree, it's like, okay, what do you bring to the table? And that's actually the perfect segue into asking, what does curriculum and instruction mean? So a question about like why that field of study, and then maybe after that, why you chose that. But so I guess first, what is curriculum and instruction?
Yeah. So curriculum and instruction has a couple of different ways that it can look at different institutions. And so I did also get, my degrees from Columbia are in curriculum and teaching, so the same type of thing. So at the University of Minnesota, the emphasis is a little bit about how people learn and the best ways to teach or support students in their education process. And I think that there is also at the University of Minnesota a little bit of an emphasis on what that means for pre-service teachers. So how do we shape the field of education and the practices of teaching and learning in how we train our teachers? At Columbia, there's a stronger focus for the curriculum and teaching department in social justice. And that's not to say that Minnesota doesn't focus on social justice. It just looks a little different. But at Columbia, the focus was about curriculum theory, which really investigates power and language and privilege and culture, and the way that institutions have hierarchical power, or the way that that influences how students are able to show up and learn.
Okay. So 3 quick questions. Remind me, so you went to like the Columbia, right?
Yeah.
And for which degree?
For my 2 master's degrees.
Wow. So that's really amazing. So I hope you heard that, folks. You know, she graduated from Columbia with her master's too. I can't believe I forgot to say that in the beginning, which is really
I often
amazing.
say that I sort of backdoored my way into Columbia because I was a teacher in New York City. And I happened to be at a school. So New York City has a choice system where you don't necessarily go to the school that's closest to where you live. You sort of apply a little bit like college for most people in the country. So I went to a school on the Upper West Side, or I taught at a school on the Upper West Side that was like, had a strong enough reputation that people were coming in. Now there's a lot to unpack about that, and I don't know that we would have time, because there are pros and cons and mini cons to a school choice system.
Mini cons.
Yeah.
I like that.
But it ends up being very racially segregated, or very segregated based on socioeconomic status. But I happened to be at a great school where even though they had this reputation, they made a huge effort to bring in or make sure that students were coming from all different types of neighborhoods from the city. But anyway, the point being that we happen to have a student teacher from Columbia, Teachers College, Columbia has its main university for undergraduates. It has Barnard University, which is like its own college, but attached to it, which is for the women. And then they have Teachers College, which is an only professional college. And so they're all kind of together. But anyway, so I had a student teacher came for math. They were placed in my classroom. And then I learned that you could get a voucher for 2 credits for Columbia when you hosted them in your classroom. And there's a rule in New York that you can't keep your teaching license after 5 years if you don't have a master's.
Oh.
And that's largely because New York has a lot of teachers who come to the profession from a different pathway. They're like teaching fellows or Teach for America. And so there's a huge emphasis on getting your master's, which I was really nervous about for funding because I had a education degree. Anyway, so I had this teacher. I had 2 credits for Columbia, and I was like, well, this is great. I can pay for my master's this way. And I just kind of went and tried to be really nice to the person who placed teachers. And I ended up having 17 student teachers and was accepted into Columbia after my 3rd class. And I started as a non-degree student. And so I feel like the reason why they accepted me was because I was already there.
Maybe, but I don't know, maybe not. And you also still did it. Did you not?
Yeah.
Like, you did it and you graduated with your master's. So even regardless of how you got in, which to me, it just sounds like you had the right connection, but you also did it. It's like,
well, in some ways,
you still did the work.
Yeah, I actually feel more proud about it being that way because I feel like it was my skill as a teacher that is the reason why my principal picked me for them to come to my class. He felt like I would be a good mentor and that I had kind of worked my way into an institution because it was my 2nd school in New York. So I feel more proud about like getting there on my teaching skills. Merit. Which,
skills.
you know, merit is like, there's definitely some stuff about the myth of meritocracy where obviously as a white woman, it's easier for me to have certain things be recognized. But that there was something about my teaching. So
yeah. That's really cool. I did not know that about you, so I love that. And to make sure I understand the curriculum and instruction piece right, so you were, so that program is focused on both like teacher prep, like those who are studying to be teachers and how to prepare them to serve like K through 12 students. Yeah. Typically, okay. And so when the program focuses on how people learn, are the people in that scenario K through 12 students?
Typically, yes.
Okay. That makes sense. So then that brings me to, so your PhD is in curriculum and instruction, so focusing on those elements. But now why? Why did you want to do that?
Yes. So I wanted to do that. So I was at that school in New York. And as I said, we had student teachers. So I had this amazing opportunity to be teaching diverse students in an amazing place, having pre-service teachers in my classroom who were also learning at the same time that I was taking graduate level classes. So there was a lot going on in my own learning and my own teaching. But I happened to be, our school transitioned to full-time co-teaching. So I had a full-time special educator that I was collaborating with for students who have disability services or special education services. And that was such a beautiful time in my teaching practice where it felt like the students who needed us the most were thriving. I was learning so much. The school was really, could be a great place, but the administration could also be bullies. And so I watched them bully my special education co-teacher, and they told her that nobody wanted to teach with her. And we were already buddies. And so I was like, well, come teach with me. And she was like, oh, I can't do math. And I was like, you definitely can. Everybody can. It's on us that they can. And then to me, I guess, to go back to your earlier question, that's what teaching, curriculum and teaching is to me, is that it's not the students who are not being successful. It's us as teachers, as people who are designing curriculum or learning experiences. We're not doing something to help everybody. And so in that teaching time, it felt like something special was going on for our students, that we had students who came from some of the toughest places in New York at the time and were able to feel loved and feel like they could do math. And I learned so much from my co-teacher. And I was really surprised that in particular there was one strategy that I ended up doing my dissertation on, but that my colleagues, who I was very close to, just weren't feeling it. And I was curious about why there was something that was working in our classroom that my caring and hardworking colleagues didn't see the same way. And I felt like so often we are stuck as teachers sitting through these things that listeners may not know, but it's called professional development. And it is the biggest waste of time generally. Not because professional development is not a good thing. It definitely is. It's more in the way that it's done.
No, as a former teacher, which my listeners know I wholeheartedly agree, and I think most teachers were, there's a huge disconnect between professional development, which is in theory supposed to help further develop teachers professionally to meet the needs of students and to work, cohesively together. But there's a major disconnect in what's presented and then what's actually going on in the classroom.
Yeah,
so
there's so much to talk about there. And I felt like I had to sit through so much professional development from people who basically left the classroom. And I feel like a lot of administrators are in this boat as well, where they taught for a few years and then they went into administration. And I was really tired of people who weren't in the trenches, more or less, telling me how easy it could be to teach, telling me how easy it is to make things meaningful and, that keep people's attention, and everything that's going wrong in the classroom is somehow your fault. And so I never wanted to leave the classroom if I wasn't going to actually help students or help teachers or recognize the realities of what it's like to teach every single day as a math teacher, to convince 12-year-olds in the afternoon to math. So I decided to get my PhD because I knew that there was something that we were doing in our classroom community that was meaningful, that wasn't necessarily being recognized in the research, because the thing that we were using, and there were many, but the things that we were using were research-based, but they weren't common in the curriculum materials. And so there was things that we were doing, and I think other people are doing it too, but that somehow wasn't getting to all teachers, because my colleagues had things that they were just resistant about. And I completely understand why. It didn't feel safe for them, and they didn't really know how, and they didn't have time, because teachers don't have time to really piece together all the things that are working and not working. And so I wanted to figure out what was going on in our classroom and how we could make it easier for other teachers to do and to learn from, in a way that wasn't positioning teachers or students who struggle with math as not enough, not working hard enough, not caring enough, not having a great growth mindset, or whatever versions of words that we use to try to make people feel like it's them, and instead be the person who left the classroom but actually helped and remembered how hard it was to be in that space. And I kind of would always say, if you're here, I don't care if you're observing me or observing my student teacher or whatever you're here doing. If you're in this classroom, you're helping us.
So to make sure I understand, and let me explain, so co-teaching in general is a model that's used at many schools. And the idea is that a general education teacher, meaning an English teacher or a math teacher or a science teacher, those kind of gen ed core subjects, is in the classroom with, often it's a special education teacher, right? So a teacher whose profession is to work with students who have some diverse learning needs. And rather than pulling those students out of the general education classroom, you keep them in the general education classroom, right? So it's that least restrictive environment, they're in there with their gen ed peers, but with somebody who has the professional expertise to meet their needs. And the idea is you work together. So when done well, it's extremely beneficial for students, but again, you have to have the proper training and the proper setting. And so what I think is really cool, because you're a math teacher, right? Math is hard.
Yes,
so I think
math is a bully.
So I think it's really cool. Not only did you develop something that worked well for your students, but you also helped your special education co-teacher to become comfortable doing math.
Yeah, and she actually, I think, will say now that she prefers to teach math, which is amazing.
Wow.
And I agree completely that co-teaching very rarely works, or I have seen it work rarely. And it's crazy to me because it was such a magical experience But there are a couple things that have to happen. One is that you have to not have an ego. You have to be willing to collaborate with somebody. And a lot of times what happens, there's different ways that co-teaching can look, but one of the ways that it looks so often is one teach, one observe, where the special education teacher is really sort of treated as the observer or the assistant teacher, or that they have their students that they're supporting. And for my co-teacher and I, it was really important to us that if you came into the room, you didn't necessarily know which one of us was the lead teacher. We both were the teachers, and you didn't necessarily know which students were receiving special education services. They were all our students. We were working together. And I think that that is part of what made it such a great experience. And I learned so much because I think math teachers so often are a little bit further behind in what we think is part of what math learning is. So the fact that you can do sums in your head might be what we think is math learning. And they are a little hesitant to things like calculators or supports what is often called modifications or accommodations in special education that we think means that the student doesn't have to do any learning or thinking. And collaborating with Catherine, which was my special education teacher, at the same time as going to Columbia, I think really helped me understand that like giving students a word bank or giving them like a graphic organizer doesn't stop them from learning math. It actually helps them show what they know. And so co-teaching was just something that was really special to me. It's sad that it doesn't always work in other places, but it does take a teacher letting somebody else take the lead sometimes.
Well, it reminds me about what you said in the beginning about owning things and owning yourself and being in a position where you're willing to learn. It really, I think, is sort of similar to any kind of working partnership almost, where it's like you sort of have to have fairly similar values, or if not similar values, you at least both have to value growth. Because if one person is convinced that they're right about everything, you're not going to get anywhere. And I think you're right. That is kind of the common story with co-teaching. But how did that experience kind of directly relate to you deciding to pursue your PhD? Did you want to like replicate kind of what happened with math with your co-teacher, or what? How did the two sort of connect?
Yeah. So as I said, so we were doing this. What really helped me was this game called Floats and Anchors, which is a game that I learned as a math teacher at a math teacher conference, and it was two ships like at sea. And you add and remove floats and anchors from these ships, and they go up and down. And that is a way for students to understand negative and positive numbers, which are called integers. And it was just a game when we learned it. And we, over time, took pieces of that game and made it part of our curriculum. And I think that that was a big difference between what was going on in our classroom and what was going on in my colleagues' classroom, because when you just played the game, it wasn't really helping students. They weren't really able to make connections between what they were doing in their formal integer learning. And our principal was very concerned about the data, like how our students did on the state assessment. And so it wasn't really a safe place to mess around with your teaching if you weren't sure that you were going to get results.
Okay.
And so I learned a lot of things just through Floats and Anchors, where there were questions that I had about what does it mean to meet the needs of a lot of different students, or what does it mean for students to be able to access the curriculum and have these deep conversations. But when we played with Floats and Anchors, I saw students who had just been in a really restricted environment where they had like at most 12 students to one teacher for the entire day, with students who had like a house in the Hamptons, and both of them, and every like privilege you could imagine. And they were able to talk about integers in a way that I had never seen before, like in the same level. And it had to do with the fact that they had things that they could move, things that were going up and down, and just lots of different ways to think about integers. And that helped me understand differentiation in my classroom in general. And so those strategies that I started to see with Floats and Anchors, I started to use in other units and design with my co-teacher. And so when I was ready to get a PhD, I wanted to figure out not only what we were doing that was working so that that could be translated better to teachers, but primarily through the curricular materials. Because I feel like right now, academia will do some really cool things and have some really good ideas, but it's a little bit of a shock and awe. Well, they'll show teachers all these cool things they can do that's not just rote math learning, but they leave all the lesson planning and fitting it into like the day-to-day teaching up to teachers. And that's the hardest part, that we don't have time to really mess with. And a lot of times it's presented as really easy things that you can do in your classroom. Just do this. And now we have differentiation. And so I wanted to leave and figure out what curriculum people needed with felt sneakers specifically, because that was one of the things I was most interested in. But then also, what were the underlying things about the approach that we were taking, so that that could also be wrapped into how we train teachers, how we design curriculum, and how we do professional development. So both of those things were a factor into what I did to get my PhD, and I left sort of feeling a lot more confident about being a curriculum designer.
It sounds like you have all of the right motivation, and I'm trying to not listen to this through the ears of a former educator, because it's like, you know, I'm trying to be objective, but I can't help but listen as an educator, because that's what I was. And it's like, that is the dream. And that's what's really important, I think, for the listeners to understand about education in America in general, is there are so many passionate educators who care a lot about what they do, but there is a disconnect between some of the training and resources that teachers have and what the day-to-day in the classroom actually looks like. And so I think that that's really beautiful that you chose to actually practice something, see that it was effective, and then go on to see how you could make it more accessible to people. So was the majority of your research then on this floats and anchors idea?
It was, yeah. It was about, what is it in this game that's helping students, and what does it look like as an entire unit for students? And in all of the moments for me, I just kind of kept going back to the fact that it was always an option for me to be a classroom teacher and to keep doing what I was doing with my co-teacher, and helping students feel like they had it in them to be math learners. Because so often we have people who just feel like they can't. But that if I was able to make a curriculum that reflected this cool strategy and some great like underlying things in the field with what it actually feels like to be a middle school student and a middle school teacher, that we could help a lot more students and we could help a lot more teachers, and that students everywhere could start to feel like they could do math, and teachers everywhere could start to feel like they're not just dumb at everything. Because sometimes you go to these professional development or conferences and they just make you feel like you're the problem.
Yeah, why doesn't everybody like
yeah, it just needs to be more engaging. And you just like, what's your why? And
that's a common one.
You know, all these, and so I felt like
teachers are shamed quite a bit.
And I feel like administrators do it, even if they don't mean to. And so I wanted teachers to feel like your instincts as a teacher, there's things that are right about that. And a big part of my research ended up being trying to show the field, and I think the field means well. So it's not even like being critical of researchers, but that integers, which are negative and positive numbers, are really hard. And they are much harder than we accept or even like show in the curriculum. And so I wanted to show that the students are having a hard time with this concept because it's hard, and that teachers are doing things that are maybe less meaningful to get to passing, you know, on the state test or getting A's or whatever.
A beautiful eagle just flew by. Okay, so sorry listeners, just really quick. She's talking about this breakthrough concept, and in her place there's like these beautiful windows, and I saw this giant bald eagle just like right outside the window, and I could not help but watch it, and then it circled around to the window where she could see it, and she saw it too. So I'm sorry, I just distracted you, but it was like, I couldn't not look at it. It was so majestic. Like,
it's crazy. And I've never seen an eagle.
No?
That was my first one here. Or here. I mean, I've seen an eagle before, but not in this house.
And it was so close.
It was really close. Yeah. So anyway, so I just wanted, I think that curriculum and instruction is about trying to create learning experiences that are meaningful, moving away from some of that memorization or just repeating what the teacher wants you to say, while also thinking about what teachers have to do, what it looks like to have standardized tests and to have families that are very concerned about their kids having A's and kids having so much of their worth in what they feel like they're able to learn and what learning looks like for them. And that was all kind of my research.
Well, and that's really beautiful. And I think you're kind of summarizing, like, this is a really good episode just for kind of learning how education works in general and areas where we could improve, because that's so true. Like that piece about like, okay, actual learning, teachers feeling safe and like they have the resources to actually teach. But then also, how do you balance the pressure of grades? How do you balance family expectations with realities of the classroom, with realities of where the students are at, this expectation again of grades versus learning? And I think something that you said about how you said something about like teachers having this sort of pressure to participate in professional development, and okay, but how does this actually, translate to the classroom? There was something about that also rang true of just, no, this is what it was. You said having the space to actually move around and try something. That's what it was. I think that's one of the issues with education in general, of like, because of the pressure of grades, and I think deadlines are important. I think grades are important. I'm not saying do away with that, but I think there maybe needs to be more of a balance of like having the space to learn and understanding that messing up or quote unquote failing or just like trying something and realizing it didn't work, like that's what learning should actually be.
Yes.
And I think having the space to do more of that would improve education both for students and teachers if we could take a little bit of the pressure off of the grades.
Yes.
And this, and putting it more on, no, it's please just be present in the learning. And some of the greatest geniuses of the world tried things a billion times and failed, quote unquote failed, to get to the right end point. But so I think just all of your work like connects so beautifully to the way that I think education should shift, which is from all this pressure being on grades to, is learning actually happening, and is there that intrinsic motivation to learn?
Yeah.
So are you comfortable sharing like why does floats and anchors work? Like, are you comfortable saying like how did that work with teaching positive and negative numbers?
Yes, I'm very happy to. Okay. First of all, floats and anchors, as I said, it wasn't designed by me. It was designed by two researchers. They actually are from the University of Minnesota, which is why when I was ready to do my PhD, I was very sick in New York my last year or so. My family had moved back to the Midwest, and so I was looking at Midwest institutions, and I actually got into two institutions that are technically more well-known or something than the University of Minnesota. But I chose Minnesota and actually defended it a little bit to Teachers College because these two people had come from the University of Minnesota and they had created floats and anchors, and I was like, I don't know what they're doing there, but floats and anchors was a real watershed moment for me in my teaching, so I'd like to go there. And so in the game, or sometimes it's just a model, which is a thing that we use in math education to mean just a way to represent a mathematical idea. But you have floats, which are like life preserver type things that go under the ship to lift it up. But also if you subtract a float, your ship would move down. And so that's a way to think about subtracting positive values. And then adding an anchor makes your ship go down. So that's a way to think about adding negative numbers.
Okay.
But if you think about a ship that's like maybe at -5 because it has anchors on it, and you remove something heavy, you subtract something that's negative, the ship will go up because it's not as heavy anymore. And so in floats and anchors, it's a way to think about why subtracting a negative has like increasing movement.
Yeah, positive effect.
Right.
Kind of. Yeah, okay.
And why subtracting a positive is decreasing. Because it's very confusing for students to see something like -10 subtract 5 and to know that that's negative 15. Because that to them, 10 and 5, it normally feels like it's adding. And so that's hard for them. And also to know why subtracting a negative can be positive or goes in a positive direction is really hard. So what I learned with Floats and Anchors and why I think it worked with my students is that it was designed differently than a lot of other models that we have. A lot of times we have models where we just use chips, which are like counters, or we use a number line, or we have different strategies, but they kind of just focus on one, what's called representation. So like looking at a number line or looking at a graph in a certain way. But Floats and Anchors was designed with what's called the lush translation model, which is that when you are able to move in between representations like words and objects and number lines and symbols, that's how you develop like deep understanding of something, and that's what learning means. And so in the game, they had already connected a vertical number line, which is much more intuitive than a horizontal number line, which for people who aren't familiar, a number line is basically like if you think about on a graph, the x-axis that has positive and negative values with 0 in the middle.
Yeah.
So horizontal number lines are very common because they don't take up much space. But a vertical number line is much more intuitive to students of being able to go up and down. And we know that students have a hard time with negative numbers because a lot of times they haven't even seen them until middle school. And I know for sure in Minnesota here, at least you have a little bit of an awareness of negative temperature. But I grew up in Northern California where it's never negative degrees. And I distinctly remember it blew my mind that there were negative numbers. And I often talk about it as like the first time that I faked math, which is even something that I don't think people talk about, that like we imagine that people who are good at math are just good at all math and they never fake it the way that people who aren't good at math feel like they have to. But I fake math all the time.
That's great.
And my friends fake math all the time. And it's actually one of the things that brings people together is when we talk about faking math at Columbia, thinking that everybody else was smarter than us and everybody realizing that we just all were not smart. Anyway, in Floats and Anchors, combining objects with what's called embodied cognition of moving up and down, connecting that to math symbols in how you can read an equation to understand what it means to add and subtract negative and positive numbers, and all those things being available in the model, then through my study, it's based on the engineering design process. So you start with a prototype, you test it, you get feedback from experts and the data, and then you redesign and you keep doing that until you have something you like. So in my study we did, I say we because I worked with so many other classroom teachers and students, but mostly me.
Yeah.
So started with a curriculum and then had 3 rounds of implementing it with small groups of students, and they were special education students or students who were in a math intervention setting with a co-teacher or 2, and we did these 3 design cycles to get to a better curriculum, and it actually ended up having 5 student groups. So altogether, these like 50 students really helped shape this curriculum, and what we landed on at the end were things that not only help students understand negative and positive numbers from Floats and Anchors, but also really in the fact that we approach negative numbers as if we can just extend what students know about positive numbers. That's the way that the curriculum and the standards have been written. But we significantly underestimated how hard integers are and how different they are from whole numbers. And it's actually in that is what my study showed, that we jump to adding and subtracting so quickly in those units because we think that students can already count and already write integers and already do all these skills with integers because they know whole numbers, which are what's called just positive numbers. And we kind of just brush over all of that and then are surprised that they're having a hard time, but we don't even teach them counting. Again, because we assume like they're middle school students, they don't need to count. They cannot count integers. It's a completely different skill because at 0, it's called what's a reflection point, where the numbers, if you're counting down from 10, the numbers are getting smaller, like 10, 9, 8, 7. The digits are going down. But when you get to 0, it flips and it goes the opposite direction. It goes 1, 2, 3, 4. We add a negative in front of it, and that's called directed distance. So you have to, when we introduce negative numbers, students have to be able to make sense of the fact that the place value feels like positive numbers, but the fact that it's negative is like working counter the way that they think. And there's all these things that are basically at odds with what they understand about numbers, which is why integers are so hard. Which is probably a much more in-depth answer.
No, it actually makes sense, and it's really important to realize that, because even when you were, because okay, I've always struggled with math, right? Like I was an English teacher, math was always hard for me growing up, but you're right, it's a completely different way of thinking. It's not just counting. There's another skill there, and
yes,
even as you were giving the example and you were saying, oh, -10, 5, it took, I was like, wait, what? Like it took me a second, because it is a completely different skill set. You probably are using different parts of the brain, I would imagine. I don't know for sure, but I would imagine. And I think that's really cool to kind of look more closely at that, oh no, this is a different skill set, and you know, we need to look at developing that.
Yeah. And even just writing integers is hard because we use a negative symbol, which in my study I call a symbolic homograph, which homographs are like the word second, where you can mean second place, or like just give me a second, which is 60 seconds for a minute. So students have to use a symbol that they have only associated with subtraction, and now use that same symbol to mean negative, which means that even just to write an integer, students have to be able to distinguish between these two symbols that look the same. And
you mean like the minus and subtraction versus the minus and
negatives. And I try not even to say the word only, because it does, we only say minus, which means subtraction. So students had to learn how to read symbols that are repeated. There's some more complications around that. This thing about the place value pattern. And then also with positive numbers, when you add, it only goes in one direction. It only increases. And then when you subtract, it goes in a decreasing direction. But with integers, it depends on what you're adding. They're both bidirectional, meaning that if you're adding a positive, it'll go in an increasing direction. But if you're adding a negative, it goes in a decreasing direction. And if you're subtracting a positive, it goes in a decreasing direction. But if you're subtracting a negative, it goes in the other direction. And so there were so many things about integers being fundamentally different that was not recognized in the curriculum. And I think that that's part of why students are then frustrated and confused, because when we think, oh, we can just extend positive numbers, you kind of know this already. And then everything doesn't work the way you expect, which is called prediction errors in cognitive learning, where what we think is going to happen doesn't happen. And normally that signals to our brain that we have to learn something. But because with integers, there's no real pattern as to why it's not working, because so many things are different, that students would leave feeling like they were just confused for no reason, because they should understand this because it's whole numbers, but B, that they, like, I guess that was maybe, but like that it's their fault that they're not understanding, when really it's us not understanding all of the ways that integers are different and need so much more attention. And right down to, they need to count like we count with 5-year-old children, you know, as they're walking along, because we were trying to teach people to add and subtract when they couldn't even count. And we would never do that with 5-year-olds.
No.
You know?
No. So I can see how this is really valuable in the classroom, right? Students are being given multiple ways of learning integers, right? Like it's not just the graph, but like you said, there's words being used, there's visuals, there's tools. It's thinking about it in a different way. And now I'm going to ask the most annoying question ever, but I'm going to, the really fun one that, you know, we all have that student that asks, but like, so real world application. Why is it good for students to learn integers? Like how can this help in the real world, learning to think like this?
Yeah, so there are ways. First of all, I think that on a social implication scale, students start to develop some of their worth around their intelligence in middle school. And we have created a situation where it's okay to say as an adult that you don't like math or you're not good at math. And that should be on math teachers. We are doing harm by having students come to our class and have them leave with this feeling of they weren't enough in our content. And so So there's this feeling of just the fact that we're able to show students that you are absolutely smart enough to do math. Mm-hmm. It's us. We are not teaching it correctly. We haven't found the right way to show you how to make this make sense, I think is a really powerful component of the work and of what was special in our classroom. That I don't really care what you're learning, as long as you believe that you can learn and that there's this like a song from, I think it was in Space Jam. I don't know if it's the Space Jam song, but they're like, it's a lyric that says like, be a leader, and if you can't be a leader, make sure your leader is a darn good teacher. And I want students to leave feeling like if there's something that you're not learning, either take the lead of your learning or realize that your teacher wasn't good enough. Like you didn't have a good enough teacher. And I know that sounds contrary to what I was just saying about how teachers are amazing, because they are. But having students recognize that if something's not working, it's not them, it's not their fault. But also that there are practical components of in subtracting a negative, that is the same as subtracting a debt or adding debt. And having that just understanding of how the number line or numbers work for negative and positive values, and why more negative is worse overall than less negative. That's an important thing for people, I guess, to understand.
Well, budgeting, it sounds like that's what you're referring to, right? Like, at negative balances, positive I mean, you need to know that every day as an adult, so I can absolutely see how that kind of thinking
and compounding interest, I think, is part of it. I think that there are a lot of things. There's a model that uses money, and there's some reasons why I think that doesn't work. One of them being that zero isn't neutral, and it's not inherently tied to movement in the same way as foot snankers. But that, and there's some underlying things about debt is bad, or you did something to do that. But yes, I think that from real world application, understanding number systems helps you understand your own financial situation. And that skill of just adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing shows up so much in the rest of math that you're less likely to be successful later on if you don't understand integers, or at least understand enough. I remember in high school saying, like, I have to do this in the calculator because my instinct is always wrong. And it was okay to have to use the calculator. But as a student, I needed to know my instinct is wrong. Because otherwise I would just do the equations and I would make mistakes. And what we see in higher math is that there become so many steps that if you do all of that work and then you don't have the right answer, students can feel very frustrated and they can feel like they didn't understand any of it. When really it was the adding and subtracting or multiplying and dividing of integers that got in the way, and that they understood the concepts of isolating a variable or inverse operations or properties that we use with equations. And so they were able to like see that this is just because adding integers are hard, or
Yeah. And I want to speak to your point of there is that real world application of just understanding the concept of negatives and positives and financial literacy and all of that. But to your point of the student's mindset about just learning math in general, that's huge. And it is true that like you never know how you will use something, because as somebody who grew up just thinking I'm bad at math, and I'll be honest, my experience in the math classroom was not good throughout my whole elementary, middle, and high school education. It was awful. And I can just tell you, like, as a teacher, a former teacher, I had awful math teachers. And I think, that although, like we said, teachers are very passionate, good people, there are sometimes, just like in any profession, people who maybe have the wrong motives, or maybe it's like, well, I know I understand this and can't always like translate it. But, I always thought I'm bad at math. It's just not for me. But never did I imagine that when I grew up, I would need to know math to save my daughter's life. And by that, I mean, like, she's a type 1 diabetic, right? So I had to learn in an emergency situation where she's in the hospital how to add and subtract decimal points and offset. Okay, I have to give her this much insulin per these many carbs. So I'm counting carbs, I'm subtracting fiber. I'm then measuring tiny decimal percentages of insulin, and it's like, I have no choice but to learn this, and I have to believe that I'm good at it, because if I don't, it's my daughter's health and potentially her life. And I wonder what would have happened, how would I have come to the table if I had had that past experience of knowing, oh, I can do this. And it worked out. Like I said, I had a very strong motivator for learning regardless of how I felt, and I did become very good at helping her to manage her health. But like, you never know how you might need to use math. And so that mindset, regardless of whether, you know, you're using it in the moment outside the classroom, even just that mindset of how you can do something or whether you can do it is huge.
Yeah. And I don't like the cliche of math is everywhere, or math is the universal language, or, you know, whatever, because it feels like a throwaway. But I think that there are things where we have such, society-wise, like a difficult relationship with math, that it shows up where we don't see math in the real world. So, for example, the way that we do time, where people are ahead of us a certain number of hours or behind us a certain number of hours, and factoring that into what's your time, what's my time, that's all integers of, okay, like, so they're -3 behind me, so then I have to apply a -3 to that, and if somebody's another 3 hours behind them, then that means we're adding hours behind us. And so I would have students in New York who were meeting friends, like, to play video games internationally, but they wanted to figure out what time their friend who lived somewhere else would be able to play, especially if their families had rules about screen time or whatever. Or my brother is actually much better at math fluency than I am. He does pizza, and so his ability to find ratios between flour and water. And I don't do it now, but for a number of years I taught in the federal penitentiary system or correctional facilities. And we had people who were like, the people who were on the inside were having a hard time with fractions when they were in like a construction job. But as soon as they were able to make equivalent, like, parallels with perhaps what got them there in measurements that are less than 1, and to see
Are you talking about drugs?
Perhaps.
Sorry.
Yeah, that
I had to just ask. Okay. Yeah.
That people we are so terrible at teaching fractions that even in a construction place where you're talking about 3/8 of an inch or, 5/16, and to make sense of what that means and be like, you actually already know this. This is, like a gram, or when you do your conversions. But that tells me again that it's us as teachers, that we're not teaching things in a way where when you're at a store and something's 25% off, and my co-teacher would say every time, I used to have to call my husband and say, okay, what is this really? Like, how much do I have to pay? And leaving our classroom and be like, I don't have to do that anymore. And so if anything, again, it just shows us how much teaching for math in particular has to show the ways that we're using math all the time.
So how did you do it? How did you get your co-teacher, your special education co-teacher said, oh no, I can't teach math? How did you get her to feel comfortable teaching math? Because that is magical. How did you do it?
So I would say I listened. I listened to what she was worried about. But I also, and I have heard my colleagues say this as well, where math wasn't my first love. I came from a home where I learned to be a problem solver and was really encouraged to do that. And I grew up in, like I said, in wine country in the Silicon Valley in the 90s. So I went to like a STEM, one of the first STEM schools. And I do think that I was really informed by like time and space of being in the Silicon Valley during the dot-com boom and having people who were really valuing innovation and creativity. And it was during that time that girls were taught you can do anything. So all of those things factored into, then when I got to college, I tested out of all my English requirements from the International Baccalaureate test. And so I was like, well, I'm not that great at math, so I'll focus on math instead. Because when you did elementary education at the University of Iowa, you had to pick a content area. So I picked math. And then learned that I was good at math, because I've never been particularly fast, which I know now is because I have like a little bit of a processing delay for decoding. And so I learned that I could do math and that I had the instinct for it, and kind of had to work through my own times of faking math as a teacher. And then I think that it made me a better teacher, and I've heard other people say that, although it's interesting because all of us will kind of say at a certain level, like, oh, you could do algebra 2, and us being like, oh, I don't know enough math for that. But so then when my teacher came to me, I knew that I can teach with anybody who wants to teach, you know, and as long as we have a collaborative relationship, then I can learn from anybody. And I have found, and I found this with my dissertation as well, that the process of breaking something down for somebody to learn helps you be a better teacher. And so listening to her of what she needed to understand the next thing that we were teaching helped us work together to find a way to teach it for our students.
Okay.
So yeah.
So kind of creating that openness of like, okay, you're hesitant to do this, why?
Right.
And then so actually just listening to what the concerns were. And then then you developed your approach to like address whatever her specific concerns were to.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I think there's two things that really like come into play. One of them is this concept that we use a lot in special education called presumed competence, which means that we are going to assume that you are capable of this. And it's on us to figure out how to get there. And so for me, everybody is capable of learning math. All teachers are for sure capable of learning math. And so just saying like, you can do this, like I'm not explaining it correctly, or I'm not listening well enough to understand what you're confused by, but you have the ability to do it. So that's one thing. And that is true for our students as well. You know, that belief in it's not something about you that's keeping you from learning. It's something about us and
or the process
But I think that it's super important, and especially for adults, to make space for people to be able to be vulnerable and honest. So often in academic settings, and especially in places where it feels competitive, because teaching is an extension of yourself. And so when you don't get something or somebody has feedback about your teaching, sometimes it can feel like a personal attack because it's part of you and your creative voice and who you are. And so in order for there to be a truly collaborative relationship, people have to feel safe to say, I don't understand what you just said. Like, I didn't get it, you know, instead of faking math or faking whatever it is, or overcompensating, almost like before, of why it bothers me where people can't say that they just made a mistake. You know, we're so scared to be vulnerable and to admit that didn't make sense. But it's actually in this, it was my project as well, where it was identifying sticking points. It's in figuring out where their sticking points are that we actually learn the most about how to help people. And so just my colleague having the space to say, like, everything you just said to me was gibberish, or I stopped listening, or whatever, like, helped me be like, okay, what is it then about that? And there was a thing that we did as teachers where we organized problems in two different ways. And I knew that the math people would say that was like a bad tactic. It was like a rote memorization type thing or meaningless. And in my study, I was like, oh, now I understand why, because it was about this, that operations work in both directions. And so in some ways, my project was about showing teachers that your instincts might be onto something, that you might be responding to something that you're seeing your students struggle with that's not reflected in the curricular materials. And so in general, with my teacher and with my students, making space for them to say, and there's a really great TED Talk, and I think his name is Yuri Alon, that he talks about being in the cloud, and how hard, and the social emotional part of doing research. But even we would show that to our students, and just to have the language of like, I'm in the cloud, meaning that I have no idea what you just said. I'm so confused. And he has a moment where, you know, they felt like they were in the cloud as PhD students, and he was like, oh, that's amazing. You must feel terrible. You must be miserable right now. You know, and like being more honest about like, no, we all have these moments of just full on confusion.
You know, I felt relief even as you were talking, and you're actually reminding me of the interview that I did with my wonderful Aunt Ginny that I was telling you about how she went into organizations. And that was always, it's similar to what you're talking about with your colleague and with your or with the classroom, where the most successful organizations, classrooms, whatever it might be, the most cohesive people all need a platform to be honest, to be honest about what's not working,
Yes.
but then also receptive to learning from that. Because as I listen to what you say about like your colleague coming to you with her concerns about what she was worried about with math, it would have done nothing if you didn't actually take that feedback into account and then incorporate it into your approach to teaching her and then your students. So there has to be this, not only am I going to listen to you, but I'm going to actually take your feedback into account when I do this. And I can imagine, you know, just even me personally, if I actually heard somebody listen to or saw somebody listening, and then I could see clear evidence that they were taking my feedback into their approach to, you know, to teaching, to running the organization, whatever it is, I would feel so validated and that much more willing to be vulnerable enough to continue to learn and feel a part of the process. So it's a very similar idea of like what people just really want is to feel safe. And
absolutely,
something I've learned from my own journey as a person and as an educator is that no learning, no growth happens if you're not willing to be vulnerable. And if people don't give you the opportunity to feel vulnerable, you know, where you feel like you have to put up these walls because they're going to think you're stupid if you don't know this, or it's like, well, you're not going to learn, because what you're going to learn how to do is to protect yourself. You're not going to learn, you know, anything beneath that. So I think it's really great that you explain that.
Yeah, and my friend, a different friend, does work in capital, and she talks about there's things like navigational capital of how to navigate higher education, or cultural capital, or language capital, which I think is called linguistic capital. And so for me, there is a version of academic capital where when you're a math person, you are respected in a different way. You're assumed to be smarter than others, which is not true necessarily. And it comes also with, I find, people who have PhDs. I hope that it's never me, or even masters. And even like what institution you went to, which is now a little bit ironic that I get to kind of claim some of that. But that in having that upper hand in the academic capital with my colleague, it would have been easy for me to sort of take this talking down approach of like, I understand math, let me help you understand math. But really, she taught me so much about special education and so much about ways that we can build in accommodations for all students that do help everybody, not just the students that we're doing them. Or like we were saying before, giving them a work bank does not take away any learning. It just gives people access to the words that they were maybe looking for. Or like when we have a consistent way that we approach something with a visual bar or whatever it is, that helps students. And so I've talked to her now because she's struggling as well in her new teaching where she's not feeling valued, and special education teachers are saying a lot that they don't feel valued. And it's so frustrating to me because everything I know about special education comes from her, and it comes from the fact that I let her be vulnerable about math, but she had so much to teach me about special education and about what it's like to support all students. And there were also things that she, from her perspective as a special education teacher who was often sort of forced to be in a corner, that I was like, the one thing that drives me insane is just if you're talking while I'm talking, it has nothing to do with you. It just has to do with my brain not being able to do two things at once. And she was like, that's something I used to do all the time. But it was because she wasn't given space as a teacher to help her students or to teach in general. And so she was sort of forced to have these private, quiet conversations. And she was laughing because we had somebody else who came in, and I can't remember why, because I don't think it was a student teacher. But they did that, and she was like, oh my gosh, I never realized how absolutely distracting that is.
Yeah.
And, and so I think what it really comes down to with academic capital is realizing it's okay to be an expert in something or to know something and to try to figure out what that looks like, but to always approach conversations from a place of learning, because every person, regardless of what their academic capital is, has a cool way of thinking and it has a way to help you.
Like I mentioned before, I've been studying a lot of successful entrepreneurs and things like that lately, and they've said similar things of like, here are people at the top, quote unquote, who've made all this money and are thriving in their business. but they say they continue to surround themselves with people who are different from them.
Yeah.
And that's so they can continue learning, but they also recognize that they don't know everything. And they said where many entrepreneurs go wrong is they want to keep their power at the top, and so then they micromanage other people and other departments. And I would say that even happens in the school systems.
Absolutely.
And leads to like what your friend felt, where it's like undervalued, you know? And so I think the best organizations thrive when people who have different skill sets and strengths work together, but that they're open to learning from each other and also just honoring the gifts that people have. Yeah. Man, it goes such a long way when you feel like somebody actually appreciates you and for what you can do and makes you then want to share more and grow more. I mean, I can think of colleagues who I had who supported me, and it didn't make me cocky. It made me feel confident that I could learn. It made me want to share more with them. It made me want to experiment more and learn more, because it's like, oh, I have somebody who believes in me. Well, now that I know that they believe in this, I can expand on it. I can learn. I can grow. And so I think it's great that you brought that up. And I have to ask you too about just how long did it take you to complete this research project and write your dissertation? Because your dissertation is like basically a very long essay, to put it simply,
it's a book,
right? Like
actually.
It's a book, you know, it's a book about all of your research, all of the data, all of your references. So how long has it taken you to do this project, start to finish, all the writing?
Yes. Well, so I'm so great at long answers. So I've been in graduate school in general for this July. It'll be 11 years. So over 10 years. I did my first 2 masters together kind of concurrently in my first 4 years, and I was teaching full time. And then I went right into my PhD. So I think on purpose lost count, because it's awful to think about how long I've been in school. But so I'm in my 7th year. I've done 6.5 years for this PhD program, and the last 2.5 have been spent just on my dissertation. I did a massive project, so that's not to scare anybody out there, although I would say think twice before you do a PhD program. I don't know that I would recommend it. But so my study, as I said, because it was huge and it was in the classroom, I defended my dissertation proposal in December of, I think it was 2022.
And so what that means is like you go in front of all the fancy people, right?
Yeah, so you have a committee of 4 or 5 professors, and I had 4. And so I created my study, and I created a proposal of what I wanted to do, and then I had to tell them about it and defend it to them before I could have approval. And then once you do that, you're called ABD, which is called all but dissertation. And so it means you're done with your coursework, because all degrees, including a PhD, includes X number of courses. And so then, because my study was in classrooms, which is rare in sort of a sad way, of curriculum and instruction is not often done with classrooms, but it's because it takes so much additional ethical checks that when you're with students, but mine included like video recordings from classrooms. So it took a huge amount of work to get the university to sign off on me going into schools and going into classrooms without doing harm. So it took me about 6 months to get ethical approval. And then, as I said, I had these 3 design cycles, and it included 2 student groups in the 2nd and 3rd cycles. So data collection was me meeting with experts and recording that, and then going into classrooms for the entire unit. And I, like I said, did it 3 times. Altogether, I think there was like 69 or 70 integer lessons that I co-taught. So data collection went from September of 2023 through February of 2024. So that 6-month period was really exhausting. And then I had a ridiculous amount of data that I had to like go through to figure out how to learn what the takeaways were about the unit and about the process. And so then it took me another year really of analyzing and reading research, and then writing up this. It's like 200 pages of the study plus another about 150 pages of the curriculum that I've just spent the last 4 months sort of writing through the night.
Yeah.
And then what I just did now a couple weeks ago was I turned that manuscript over to my committee. They read it. They gave me feedback. And then I had to do a hour-long public defense where people could come, and I did this last Friday, where people come and I tell them about my research, and then it goes into a private defense with just those 4 people who say, like, ask you questions about your work, and then at the end of it, you're a doctor.
And then you're a doctor.
If you don't die in the process.
Wow. I really admire that, though, because what you said about your study actually being in the classrooms, you know, and how it's sad that that's a rare thing, that seems to just align with your value of, okay, if I'm going to leave the classroom and I'm going to develop curriculum that helps teachers and students, I'm going to make sure I do it right and that it's relevant. So I think that you actually taking the extra steps and working in schools says a lot, and it's what is needed. So all in all, the dissertation part, your research, processing the data, writing it up, that would, like, because you said, was it 2022 that you defended your idea? So all in all, it's been 3-4-ish years?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah,
if I'm,
okay.
probably. Because I think my last coursework was in the spring of 2022.
Okay. Yeah.
I think that's right. So
yeah, that's a commitment.
It's very long. People can go through it faster. I've had friends who do it quicker. But for me, I never wanted to be a researcher. I didn't really care about research. And if anything, I kind of felt like they were out of touch.
Yeah.
Which is not fair to some of the people whose work I've built off of. But it did feel disconnected from what it was like to be a middle school teacher. And I think that if I hadn't found research that was so closely connected to practice, that I just wouldn't have done it. You know, like I would rather do the work myself as a classroom teacher, or I have colleagues or mentors in New York who do more practical based, like math camp type things. I would have done that instead, because I don't care that much about research that doesn't actually help students. And the other thing that I found was that in my study, it uses what's called universal design for learning, which is this idea that when we design something for everybody to begin with, that it actually is better for everyone. So a really common example is closed captioning. So it used to be that, and I remember this as a kid, that there was a special box that was on your computer or on your TV, but that we used to have those announcements like from PBS where they'd be like, closed captioning was provided by...
I remember that.
Yeah.
Yep, I remember that.
So back in the day, you used to have to get a special box. You used to have special people who were paid to do closed captioning. And then they built it into all TVs, and that cost went way down. And now closed captioning is something that we use all the time. We use it at the gym. We use it at airports. It helps people who are listening to something in a different language. It helps people who are learning a language. It helps me when I'm listening to British television and I can't quite hear. Like, I've even heard people say now, like, that they can't hear without the subtitles. And so what used to be a special thing just for people who had hearing implications or needed modifications is now something that helps everybody in lots of different situations. And that's actually how we should approach teaching and curriculum design, that we should approach it as everybody can learn together. We don't need to have these advanced student classes and special education classes and, you know, your worth being tied to who your math teacher is. And instead that they can learn all together. It's on us to design something from the beginning. And just like with closed captioning, when we do, everybody does better. Because the students who are able to learn something without a graphic organizer or a sentence starter or whatever, that's fine. But they also learn when we add those in. And so everybody does better. And that means a lot to me to say that we can all do it.
That's a really beautiful way to explain it. And I think so many people would learn so much more, you know, if it was if it was from that perspective. Here's a resource or here's a method that helps everybody, you know, and it can still be individual, you know, based on needs and skills. So is that kind of what kept you going during the long nights and the pressure? Because it's a lot of pressure and meetings and deadlines. So is it sort of that motivation to just make this type of math more accessible to educators and students? Was it that kept you going, or was it that plus something? Okay.
Yeah, it was definitely that students, this will really help students, that we have so many middle school students who feel like it's on them. And if I can figure this out, I can give teachers a curriculum that makes it make sense. Because like I said, so often we'll say, oh, you just differentiate. And I felt like I would leave those meetings being like, I don't even know what differentiation is. And they would repeat back to me, you know, the formal definition. And I'd be like, right, but I don't know what that looks like in my classroom. So I think that it's really important that teachers still have agency when they're given curriculum, that they're not made to feel like they have to follow that and somebody smarter than them design these lessons. But I think it's really unfair to go to teachers and say, you can do all these magical things, but I'm not going to help you at all. So I wanted to like make it.
Sorry, I can just relate too hard to that. Sorry.
Yeah, like, oh, it can be so magical, but you have to figure it out. And it took me, as we said with this project, like it took me at least 2 years just to figure out one unit for one math grade. And we think that teachers are going to be able to like design units in real time. Like, it's just awful. And so for me, there was a piece of that, but there was also a piece of getting a PhD. I don't think that it's malicious, but I think that there is something about that academic capital and that ego that shows up where I felt much more supported for a lot of my master's program than I did in my PhD program. I feel like there is a little bit of a process of tearing you down. And I definitely received the message a few times in my first couple of years of like, stay in your lane, you're not that bright.
Oh.
For sure. And I think some of it was a little bit of an ego compensation from coming from Columbia, which I knew I had backdoored my way into, you know, but that there were people who, because I had a different background in curriculum theory, that wasn't always like well received here at the University of Minnesota, because like I said, they have different strengths, the two institutions. And so there were things where I felt a little beaten down about. And so there was part of me identifying more as a special education student than I realized, where I was like, no, I can do this. They are possibly presuming incompetence of me. And I had internalized so much the importance of presumed competence that I was like, no, I can do this. Like, it might take me longer. I can do this. And then the more I knew, and because I had done a research study on something that I knew as a classroom teacher, which the people who had done the research hadn't, and they're great. Like, that's not a thing about them at all. But they did professional development, and they had never studied it as classroom teachers. And so I felt like a certain amount of, you can tell me all you want, but I'm a classroom teacher who just saw this work with my students. And I saw it work with my 7th grade students who had been identified as needing co-teaching, but I saw it work with my advanced 6th grade students as well. And so there were moments where I got really set in almost dissent almost of saying like, I don't actually care if you think I can do this. I know I can. And started believing in myself. And in some ways I felt that fracture between practice and theory more. And I forget, I was going to say something else about that. But so what I would say is that I am a survivor. I come from a childhood where there were a lot of wonderful things, but required a lot of me finding strength in myself and resilience and trying to figure out patterns so that I can survive with like social things, but also knowing when you just have to reject the narrative and be strong in yourself and decide that like, I'm just not going to take this. And that happened to me in my program. And we really turned a corner the more strength that I had. It took a long time to get there, but now I leave the university with really wonderful relationships with people, but it took that defiance almost of, just because I'm a slower writer or I'm slower at this project, which is a huge project, does not mean that I'm not worthy. And sort of finding my own strength and humility in that strength, but that strength is what got me through.
I'm sorry, I was getting really emotional. Okay, I've got to.
I just feel like I talk so much. I'm so sorry.
No. Nope. I have to find the words now. I have to just get out of that space of absorbing it so that I can say this. I hope my listeners heard that, because that was just so beautiful. And I loved the words that you used, deciding to reject the narrative, because I think anytime you do anything revolutionary or creative, there's always that rejection. And I feel like no matter what your field is, whether it is academia or entrepreneurship or, just, or unions, whatever it might be, there's always this hierarchy. There's always ego everywhere you go. People who reject you because you might be trying to do something different, or even reject you because they know you do have very powerful, informative experience. And I think that you're getting to the place where you were able to, knowing when to reject the narrative and then coming full circle to where you were respected for everything you did is just so beautiful. And thank you for being vulnerable enough to share about your childhood, because I don't think, any of us deserve some of, whether it's trauma or just some of the survival instincts we've had to develop. None of us deserve that. Yet if it was handed to us, we have to figure out what to do. And so I think it's really cool and a really important part of the healing process to look on adaptations that you had to make and how that served you in your adult life. I want to make it clear, nobody deserves trauma. No child should have to develop certain things. But I do know from my own experience with different challenges that looking at, okay, I'm not glad that this happened, but because this happened, I've developed these resiliency skills and I can use them in a way that serves me now. That's really cool. So thank you for being vulnerable enough to go there. I appreciate it. And I want to know, so what now? what now with all of your research, and where do you want to go next? Do you want to go back to the classroom? Are you going to do more research? Or
I don't 100% know what it looks like for me. I know, as I said, I never wanted to be a person who lost touch with the classroom. And so I have always wanted to figure out a way to be ideally a public teacher at the same time as doing my whatever work I do. And so when I lived in Charleston in South Carolina, they had like an A-B day schedule. And so there were teachers who taught basically a 25% schedule where they every other day they taught half a day. And so if I could find a situation like that where I could be a middle school or high school teacher, I would love that, because I think that when I go back to when I was at Columbia and I was teaching and that collaborative time, it was so important that I was in the classroom at the same time to make sense of that. And I think that that's part of the reason why people get disconnected from the classroom, because it's easy to remember the good times, but so I'm about to, and I told you ahead of time that I'm a little nervous because I still have one last step of getting my work visa, but I have a job in Canada, and so I'm moving to just south of Montreal, which I'm really excited about, because this is again a longer answer, but so I grew up in California, but I did ballet, and so it was important for me to do French when I was in school, and a lot of people in Northern California were like, that is just a ridiculous thing to do, to spend your time learning a language when you should be learning Spanish, because we have so many people who speak Spanish on the West Coast. And I didn't care. I wanted to learn French. And I will say in general, it's so important to learn the things that you care about, because if I'd been forced to learn something that I wasn't that interested in at the time, it wouldn't have really meant anything to me. And that's not to say that I don't think learning Spanish is important, because I do, and I think I would like to learn it someday. But I did French, and because I was a dancer. And then I went to French camp in Montreal for 3 summers in a row, and I actually cleaned bathrooms so that I had enough money to go there, because I came from a very poor family. And it's so ironic to me that I got this job at the University of Minnesota because of work that I had done as a student teacher, supervising student teachers, which again is ironic for more than we have time to talk about. But I got this job with an NSF grant that teaches community college instructors how to make anatomy and physiology more accessible to everyone. And when I started this job, they said, we own it here at the University of Minnesota, but we work with 3 other institutions when we have people on our lead team at all those institutions. And we would actually really love for you to go to Montreal, because we have 2 people who are there just south of Montreal, and they have all of our what's called quant data, which means like numbers-based data. And I have all of our qual data, which is all of the interviews that we've done. And so it would be really great if we had them together. And I thought, what an amazing thing that this is, that I'm being offered to go to a place I had always wanted to go to. I wanted to go to McGill University, didn't have the SAT scores to get in, which is ironic, now going as an Ivy League grad.
Right.
But that and that I'm learning French again, and I continued in college. So how important is that? It doesn't matter what you learn. It just matters that you care about what you're learning. So I'm going there. I will continue to work on this grant for the next year. I hope to go into some sort of teaching position while I'm there. I don't know exactly what it looks like. I like doing curriculum design. I think that that's really meaningful. We are looking here at using my data also for an NSF grant at the U that I will hopefully still be connected with. And then I do, like as I said, work with incarcerated students. And the last time I was in Montreal, I got to meet somebody who does that work in Canada. Mm-hmm. So what's next is some version of teaching, working with students, curriculum design, incarcerated students. Mm-hmm. And I don't know. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how that makes me enough money that I don't have to worry about student loans, but something like that.
Wow. I think it's really beautiful how you explained how it's all sort of connected, you know,
Yes.
like learning French when you were young, dancing in Montreal, and I am just so excited for you that you get to move somewhere that you've dreamed about, you know. And even if you don't know, you know, the future 10 steps ahead, you know the next couple, and
right.
you never know what will lead to what. And I'm so glad that you brought up the test score thing, that mm-hmm. like you didn't have the SATs to get in at whatever time, but you then transferred from an Ivy League school, because I can relate. You know, I took the ACTs, barely got, like, I got the minimum score to get into the college I wanted to go to, and it was only because I compensated with writing a really good essay and whatever, but then went on to graduate grad school with honors, and like I excelled in college. So it's like test scores, that, I mean, that's a whole other conversation about evaluating people based on test scores, because that's just a whole other conversation. Yeah. So I appreciate that you included the part about you still were able to achieve your dreams or make these big strides despite certain like barriers or parameters that were set up to not allow you to those things. Yeah. It all kind of worked out.
And I definitely learned that in this program, that it was so hard that eventually I got cognitive testing, and I had sort of extreme cognitive testing, meaning like 11 hours, because I didn't know if I had ADHD or what. And my doctor was like, well, if you go to this place, they'll tell you what you do have, you know. And I do ironically have ADHD, which women are very often underdiagnosed, but I also have OCD, which nobody was surprised about. But what I learned in that process was that it takes me longer. I have a little bit of a processing delay, as we talked about earlier, in the moment. But then I also have this other thing where once something is in my long-term memory, my ability to recall things from my long-term memory is like off the charts. They've never seen it. And when the doctor was talking to me, she was like, this thing, I've never seen it so high. She's like, but your processing thing, whatever they were measuring, she's like, low as you can go, you know, and that's a little bit confusing. And so it was really helpful for me. I didn't necessarily identify as a special education student going into this study, but I can see now that I had compassion because there was something in me, and I think because I was savvy enough in navigating academic situations, or smart enough in ways that like translated, you know, like with it, like you were saying with writing, with the International Baccalaureate test, that I just understood I just needed more time. And I started to just reject their timelines, which my advisor now would laugh about, because literally I did not make a single one where it was like, it's just going to take me longer to get this thing done. And eventually they learned that when I had more time, I was able to do really good things. It just was excruciatingly slow to watch. And same thing with my study, that I would have been done faster with a smaller project. I would have been done faster for a number of different things, but I wanted to do this project that I cared about, and it took me forever because I'm slow. But what I was able to come up with was a completely different answer than the field had. And whether that's right or not is okay, because it created room for a conversation. So I would say that to anybody out there, like, it's okay to be on the slow trolley. It's okay. And then I had a little note that I wrote myself that, like, my ability to connect with humans and be compassionate and learn from my own experiences allowed me, and prioritize classrooms, allowed me to see something that other people didn't see. And I think that's true of all of us, that there are things that are our own experiences that we just see something, and we need to be encouraged more often to shine light on that instead of hiding it.
Wow. Yeah, I 100% agree. I 100% agree. And there's a billion things that I want to say, but I'll just say this. I think your own experience with processing things a certain way, it's like you just proved on so many levels that when it comes to learning, education, growth, it's like it can happen. I mean, you are this distinguished academic professional with this processing situation, but you just did it. You know what I mean? You just did it. And you found ways to show people that they can with that perceived competence. And I think, this conversation could do a lot for education settings and what works, but I think there's so much to be learned even in the adult world from the classroom, because someone very close to me right now is very unhappy in their job and they feel talked down to, they feel undervalued.
So many people feel like that right now.
They feel like they're not being even trained properly in their jobs. Do you know how many professional corporations struggle with training?
Yeah.
So many. And I think that the professional world could learn a lot from the educational world, and even from what you said of just like so many things get in the way. The ego of the supervisors, the just missing that piece, that processing piece of like, oh, well, yeah, this is a completely different skill. And so I think especially in fast-paced corporate America, people just don't invest in people enough and or see the value in it. And we've got the ego, we've got the hierarchy, but I think so many people could learn from what you said about creating that safe space to be vulnerable, to learn, to build on each other's strengths, but also to recognize that maybe we need to do away with some of these labels, like understand learning differences, but like understand how all of those learning differences can work together.
There are strengths, absolutely. And that labeling and sorting is just not helping us. And in fact, has gotten us to where we are. And I think that so much of it is about control, controlling what we're afraid of critical questions that make us lose control as leaders, or that people will only work out of fear, and I've seen this with this call to bring people back to offices after working from home, even though numbers were up and profits were up and productivity was up, but that they can't control you when you're not in their building. And so I think all of that is really important. And I think no matter what you're doing, there was a quote, and it's not mine at all, but there's a thing where it's like, I didn't come this far to only come this far. And that I thought about that a lot in my dissertation study. Now, I want to make sure that it's clear that there is also a huge amount of strength in saying the sunk cost is too much, and recognizing that you're too far down a path to say like, yeah, this isn't for me. I can always change my mind. So there's strength in that. But for me, there was strength in saying like, I'm not going to let anybody take from me all the work that I just did, and for me to finish just shy of the finish line. I can do it. It's going to take a minute. I didn't do all this just to land here.
Wow. That's true. I think I could relate too much to that personally, I think. So it's hard for me to share a general application for that, because all I could do is just think about my own life and the shift that I made, in my career, where it was like, I've come too far to only come this far. So so that's a really cool way to say it.
And when you were talking about things being interconnected, I very much believe that once you start to see how everything is interconnected, then you do see it everywhere. And even so, I go to the gym where they do like weightlifting, which is not my normal thing. I do it because I have celiac disease, and there's a huge correlation between bone density issues and people who have celiac. So I do it to like kind of ward that off. But I love the trainer that we have, because we do these small group classes, and we have people in their 60s and 70s who are in this class, and then we have people who are just exactly like you would imagine, those big buff guys. But we all do the same routine. And there are times where people aren't doing the barbell, or there are times where the barbell is less or whatever, but there's never women are doing this and men are doing this, or people under 40 are doing this and people older are doing this. It's always the same thing. And it's the trainer thinks a lot about like, what do you need? Like if you have to mod out, a exercise because of injury, that's one thing. But that like everybody can lift weights, women can do the same thing that men can do in that way. And he's absolutely right. And then I would watch that from a teacher standpoint and be like, this is the best way for people to learn differentiation. That this is what it is, that we're all doing the same thing, but perhaps somebody has a yoga block, you know, because they're for their knees, or like they're doing lighter weights, or they're doing something differently slightly. But that approach, and it was amazing for me to be like, I wish people could come see this, because this is universal design for learning, you know? And of course there's that underlying, like, some of that ableism, but the way that they also have that presumed competence of whatever body things you're going through, we can still make this work.
You reminded me of my writing class that I'm in right now. You know, I go every other week, and it's men and women, but it's also people of multiple ages. And to be honest, most of them are actually in their 60s, 70s, and even some in their 80s.
Yeah.
There's a few of us who are in our 30s, and then maybe a couple in their 20s. But it's like multiple genders, multiple ability levels. We're all coming, like, we've got retired folks who are writing novels for the first time. You know, we've got me and people like me who are like, who've written a couple things but just want to learn and share and experience from others. You've got people who are writing memoirs, poetry, I mean, all different things, but it's like we are all together in a circle sharing the same things, sharing similar things from our different perspectives, and nobody is doing anything different based on their age or gender or experience level. And kind of like just what you were saying, I love it so much there. And that's probably the thing that I love most, is that feeling of equality, but also how you, when you're all just kind of doing the same thing but bringing your own opinions, flares, needs to it, there is growth that happens there. And so I'm glad that you brought that up, because we all have our own version of that. Is there anything that I have not asked you about that you would like to share about?
No, I don't think so. Thank you for letting me do all this talking.
I love when you talk. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to interview you, because I love when you talk, and there's a little bit of a magic there. So I'm so grateful to you for sharing your experience, and I'm so excited for my listeners to hear this, because there's so much just beauty in this episode, of the learning process, of considering education from a different perspective, of feeling out how we can use some of what you've learned even in the corporate world, or even just in our conversations with each other about just coming from a place of vulnerability and learning rather than ego and creating narratives. And so thank you for everything.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
And thank you again to my listeners. I appreciate you, and I'll talk to you soon.